Hey everybody, Dr. Dave Marquis here, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about something that's near and dear to all of us, and that's food. We all love it, and we all hate it. How many times do you walk to the fridge in a day and open that thing up and stare and say, there's nothing here to eat? The thing's packed, and you're like, there's nothing here to eat. Or somebody says, what are we going to have for dinner? And you're like, that's the last decision I want to make. Can't you just make that decision for me and feed me? Food can be so pleasurable, but it can be so tormenting to us. Well, there's a whole nother side to food, and it's its darker side. It's the one that sneaks in and impacts our immune system in ways that we just don't understand. Sometimes it's obvious, like the kid that eats the peanut and ends up with anaphylaxis and needs the EpiPen, or the strawberries and you get hives or a rash in your mouth. Those are obvious things. But sometimes it's really sneaky. Things that you might consume and you take 4 days before you even manifest an inflammatory response, but you wake up 4 days after eating something and your hands don't work. Your joints are all swollen, or you've got this migraine developing and it kind of goes on for a few days. So there's different components to your immune system that have the opportunity to have a meet and greet with the stuff that you eat, okay? There's even a couple of antibodies, and if you've ever been in my office, you've probably heard me say this. I call them the Taco Bell antibodies. Sorry, Taco Bell, but not so much. Many people, when they consume that food, they end up in the restroom within about an hour. And so that would be not that anaphylactic type thing, like the IgE type antibodies, but it's more the IgA, IgM, the stuff in the mucosal membrane that the immune system says, this isn't going to stay in this pipe for long, and it causes you to have a loose stool pretty quickly. So I know that most people have experienced at least part of that spectrum, maybe not every aspect of it, where you have the delayed hypersensitivity, the immediate one, and these midterm things, but none of them are comfortable, right? We really don't like to worry about what we're eating, and yet over the last couple of decades I've noticed that more and more people are becoming more and more intolerant to more and more foods. I mean, I've got some folks that come in here and it's like they can suck on ice cubes and play with yarn in the corner because that's about the only thing that they can put in their body and not react to. So somehow we need to identify what the body's not working well with, understand why, and help us to remove those things so that we can reduce our inflammatory state and then hopefully get back to a point in time where we can eat again and broaden things out. That's a lot of what we help people do when they're struggling. And it's interesting, almost any inflammatory state has a dietary component to it. So I find it a very useful tool for most patients to investigate at some point in time, to understand what their body's immune system has done relative to the things that they're consuming. Now, genetically, I find that there's commonly 3 groups of food families that we might not have the functional capacity or the enzyme load to break down well. And that kind of falls into the histamine group, the lectin group, or the sulfur group, just as big umbrellas. Doesn't necessarily mean that every single one of the foods in those families are going to be problematic, but if you find that enzymatically, due to genetics, you're compromised, you just don't make enough of that enzyme family to break those things down, then those foods tend to linger longer in the GI tract. And your GI tract, just deep to the surface, has most of your immune system. And so they're kind of the last line of defense to come out and have a meet and greet with whatever's lingering there. And as they interface with that, that's when inflammation ensues. And that can present in a lot of ways. It can be like eczema. It can be rheumatoid arthritis. It can be things like Hashimoto's. It can be migraines. You name the inflammatory state, and I'll show you a way that food can be involved in it. Certainly doesn't mean that food is always the main trigger, but more often than not, it's intimately involved. So, Once we do testing with an individual and we determine what some of their genetic predispositions are, and we've done some food panels to get an idea of what snapshots their immune system has taken of food, and you start to get an idea of what groupings need to be removed, there's usually a time period that you need to eliminate those foods for. So our immune system has a kind of a life cycle to it, if you will. And the white blood cells that carry much of these memory cells that identify food, they live on average about 120 days. So they're either going to die in the line of duty or they're going to die of old age at around 120 days. So we like to kind of use that 4-ish month mark to be the time period that we work on eliminating food. And this is just ballparking, but you'll typically see improvements in month chunks. So if somebody is willing to really dive into this whole project, identify what they're reacting to, and eliminate those foods while doing other things to support the GI tract so that it starts to go through a mending process, if you will, as the inflammation reduces, then on the back side of that, you have a much better chance of reintroducing some of the foods that were more collateral damage, if you will. They weren't primary triggers. And honestly, most of the foods that I see on people's panels are collateral. There's usually only a handful that you truly need to avoid. Case in point, when I did my first panel on myself, 20 years ago, I had like 2 pages of food. I mean, I wanted to use it for tissue paper to cry with as I was looking at it, because there was so little that I could eat without being inflamed. I think all the years in school and starting a family and a business just tore up my GI tract. And stress kills, it does. I mean, I was walking proof of this. And so by eliminating these trigger foods for a period of time, all of a sudden the inflammation goes, but interestingly, if you're not prepared with knowing what you can eat, your stress goes, it goes the other direction. And so then it's counterproductive. So it's so important when you gather this information to apply it in a state of preparedness and mental readiness so that it doesn't drive you nuts, because it will. And particularly if somebody just says, oh, I need to avoid histamines, and they go on Google and what are histamine foods? You'll go nuts. So be specific to your body. Get the labs done so that you can understand what you truly need to avoid. So you'll avoid food for a period of time. 4 months is the short end for the majority of food. 6 months is the longer end of the elimination for most foods. And then you start a reintroduction. And what I like to do is pick the ones that you don't have the genetic predisposition for lacking enzymes for. Start with those first, because you're usually able to reintroduce those quite successfully. And the way that you do that is you'll bring one food in and you'll eat it for like 3 days in a row, so that you only have one X factor that is entering your equation. And if you do well with that, awesome. Put that thing in rotation. And then you start in with your next food, and so forth. It takes a while to reintroduce these foods, and some of the foods that you eliminated you may never even want, so you don't have to put them back in. But there's probably things on that list that you're like, you know what, I'd be happier if I could eat that. And those are the ones that you kind of want to work up to. Well, if you notice that you have an adverse response sometime within that week of consuming this new food, then you know you probably need to back up, pause, get yourself back to that set point where you were feeling better, and then start again. Now that's one more caveat that I want to impress upon you. Never reintroduce food until you're feeling better. Yet you have to experience the good change before you poke the bear to see if you're going to have an inflammatory response or any negative repercussions. Otherwise, you don't know. That's why you give your body this time period. And generally speaking, 30 days is the rough ballpark for most people to get to a spot where they're literally standing on a higher plateau metabolically and feeling better. And they notice, they're like, yeah, you know what, I do feel better. I feel better consistently. That's a time when you can start to reintroduce some things and test it out. So understand that most people don't have true allergies that they're unaware of, but Conversely, most people do have intolerances that they're completely unaware of. Those are two different things, but they both impact us in a negative way. It behooves us, before we start masking symptoms of inflammation, to understand what might be causing our inflammation. And so it's what we do every day. I mean, unless you're fasting, you're eating. So recognize that our immune system, relative to food, can have a significant impact on our well-being in every aspect of our physicality, our mental function, our digestive function. Everything about us is related to how we eat. So take the time, if you haven't already, and you're dealing with something inflammatory that you just can't nail down, look at food. It may be inflaming you. And have a functional medicine doc guide you through that process of elimination and restoration, because it can be really liberating and improve the quality of your life. Have a great day.